Going to have,
Sorry.
it's okay. I'm gonna continue that. So this morning, we are very, very fortunate to have Tori Burket with us. All of you had an opportunity to watch her video either last night or this morning. And then, as you know, posted the discussion board questions. So really, I'm going to stop my screen share because you don't need to see the schedule, but we thought we'd open it up if you want to turn your cameras on, and feel free to ask your questions, ask different questions, start a discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know I have some of the questions you guys submitted, so I'm happy to start with those, or if you guys just kind of want to rapid fire throw questions at me, that works too. So whatever makes sense.
Tori, why don't we start with some of the ones that were sent to you? Did any of them make you go, I saw some of those last night.
Yeah, these are some great questions that you guys sent me. So I will start with those. Okay, let's see. The first one I have is asking, what does it take for a disease to become a reportable disease? And how many people have to get this disease for it to become an epidemic? So that's a good question. So I can explain our reportable disease system. So CDC has a list of what they call nationally notifiable diseases. So these are diseases that they ask state and local health departments to provide them information for and investigate so that we can better respond and stop things like outbreaks and other transmission. And then there's another list of diseases that are called reportable diseases. So these are similar, but they vary by state. So that notifiable disease list, that's a federal list that comes from CDC. And then reportable diseases are determined by state and local health departments. There's typically a lot of overlap between those lists. You'll see notifiable diseases on the reportable disease list and vice versa, but they're not always the same. So some of that there are some diseases that are more common in certain areas. So I think in the US, a good example is probably something like hantavirus. So here in Colorado, hantavirus is a reportable disease because we do see hantavirus. It happens here, but you may find a state in a different part of the United States where they don't see that. So hantavirus is not reportable. And there's a couple of other examples. Those lists are really long. I think the federal list has 100 and something, 120, 110, somewhere around there, diseases on it, and the reportable lists vary by state. For a disease to become reportable, typically there's a few things that are looked at. So one of the things is how infectious it is. So if someone has that disease and someone else is exposed to them, how likely will that second person become infected with that disease? Things like disease severity. So if somebody were to be infected with that disease, how often would it be possible for that person to potentially be hospitalized or develop severe symptoms, or it potentially die from that disease? So those are a few of the things that come into play. So something like COVID, for example, when COVID first started happening and being reported at the end of 2019 into early 2020, it wasn't a reportable disease at that time, partly because we didn't know it existed. And then after we discovered, yes, this is a disease that can transmit among people, it can cause severe illness, we're starting to see it all over, then it was added to that list on there. So these lists change over time, depending on kind of what we're seeing, if new diseases pop up or other ones fade away. In terms of how many people have to get a disease for it to become an epidemic, I'm actually not sure if there is like a specific number. I'd have to look that up, and that's one of the ones I didn't have a chance to look up. So that's a good question. I can definitely look that up and email the folks that organize this to get that answer back to you guys.
Tori, is there a difference also between an epidemic and a pandemic? When does it become from an epidemic to a pandemic? I think is another question I was thinking for that one too.
Yeah, so typically an epidemic is more localized to a specific area. So you may have a disease that's only affecting a certain region. It may only be affecting a certain country. A pandemic is something that is typically affecting larger areas, so like the entire world or larger regions. So with COVID-19, we call that a pandemic because we have cases and outbreaks being reported all over the world and basically every country. Whereas something, say, like Ebola, we would say the Ebola outbreak that was happening in like the Democratic Republic of Congo a couple of years ago, and more recently, we would call that more of an epidemic since it's more localized to a specific region in Africa, as opposed to worldwide. And if you guys have any follow-up questions while I'm answering some of these, feel free to, I'm looking at my screen right now, I can see if you have like the little hand emoji that comes up, or you can unmute yourself and ask any follow-ups, that's totally fine. Let's see, the next question I had was, what is the most interesting outbreak that you've investigated? Are there any particularly unique sources? That's a good one. I've worked a lot of interesting outbreaks over my career. I would say probably one of the more interesting ones was a couple of years ago, I think it was the summer of 2018, we had a water contamination at Waterworld, which is a very large water park here in Colorado. And we had about 20,000 people that were exposed to a variety of things that got into the water system. So bacteria, viruses, all of that kind of good stuff. And so that was a pretty interesting investigation, I think, largely because of the scope of people that were involved. I mean, we deal with outbreaks all the time. You know, the average outbreak is only a handful of people. I mean, technically the definition for an outbreak is 2 or more unrelated people that had the same sort of exposure. I mean, obviously there's differences for different diseases in that definition, but typically 2 or more people. And this was a situation where we potentially had 20,000 people that were exposed. And we did end up having people that got sick from that event. We did have an outbreak of a couple of different diseases, but there was a lot of media attention. You know, there was the factor, we had environmental factors. So we had to deal with, you know, the water system needed to be cleaned, the entire property needed to be cleaned, you know, hyperchlorinating the pools to get rid of anything that could have been in there, all of that kind of stuff. So that was a really interesting one just because it was such a large investigation and involved a lot of different departments. And there were just a lot of people involved. And I see a comment that someone was there that day. Yeah, so that was the June, I think it was the June of 2018, the very beginning of June. It was a very hot summer, so lots of people were at Waterworld, which I will add, they were a great facility to work with. I would have no qualms about going back there. It was kind of an unfortunate situation that happened, but they were great to work with. Let's see, any particularly unique sources? Outbreaks involving food can be pretty interesting because, you know, we have outbreaks that involved, say you're talking about like onions that have been contaminated with E. coli. Well, if you think about the number of dishes that have onions in them, so things like salsa and pot roast and like all of these other things, and you can have people that go to a restaurant and order dishes that have, you know, small ingredients, cilantro, onions, these small things in them, and it can be really hard to figure out what made someone sick. Especially with an ingredient like that that's in a lot of things. So those are pretty interesting, especially when you have multi-state outbreaks that involve things like ingredients like onions or peppers or what have you there. So those are always interesting too, because then you have to collaborate with other states and get that information and kind of narrow down the source, which can be a challenge, but is a pretty fun experience once you kind of figure it out and have that aha moment. Okay, let's see. The next question was there a specific case or experience you had that allowed you to know that you wanted to work as an epidemiologist? When I first started reading into it, I think most of what got me interested was reading about it, not kind of my own experience at that time. And I remember reading about an outbreak investigation where states and the CDC were starting to see an increase in the number of salmonella cases among teenage girls. And they were not seeing that increase in other age groups or among men. And they were kind of sitting there wondering, you know, like, what is it that teenage girls are doing that's making them get salmonella more than other people? You know, and as part of disease investigations, we have standard case report forms for all of these diseases that when you investigate, to ask different questions. You know, if a bacteria or something can be found in the water, you know, we'll ask people about, have they been in water, doing water activities? You know, where does your drinking water come from? You know, if it's in food, we'll ask some food questions, but they're not, you know, all encompassing. There are things that we miss just because, you know, these bacteria and viruses can be all over the place. And this was one where the case investigation data wasn't pointing them to a specific source. So they started doing what they call open-ended interviews. So they were just calling people saying, you know, on a day-to-day basis, what do you do? What do you eat? You know, when you hang out with your friends, what do you do? And through those interviews, they ended up finding out that it was raw cookie dough, and that teenage girls tend to be more of the ones that are like hanging out with friends and baking cookies and, you know, eating raw cookie dough, which, like, who doesn't do that? I do that. I've done that for a long time. And that's where it was coming from. It was salmonella coming from raw cookie dough. So I thought that was really interesting, you know, kind of how they ended up figuring out what it was. A more nerdy example, I guess, was, you know, when you're in grad school for epidemiology, Jon Snow, not the one from Game of Thrones, but the father of epidemiology, is one of the first people that they talk about. And I remember being really fascinated with kind of the process for how, you know, he developed kind of what epidemiology is and like what some epidemiology processes are. And in his specific example, if you guys want to Google it, if you haven't heard about it, they were trying to figure out where cholera was coming from. And this was in the 1850s, I want to say. So they had this kind of outbreak of cholera going on, I want to say in London, and they just couldn't figure out where it was coming from. There wasn't a lot known about cholera at the time. And he was able to kind of map people, where they lived, where they were getting their water from, and figure out that there was a specific pump that had been contaminated. And that's, you know, where the majority was coming from. So that was pretty interesting to me. And those kind of two examples was like, I'm a really nosy person, and I just thought it was cool that I get to be nosy and like figure things out for a living, which is cool. Yeah, and there's a comment, for the record, I love raw cookie dough. Same, and I do this for a living and I still eat it, which is like not a good, I guess probably not a good life example to set for you guys, but such is life. We're not all perfect.
They now sell cookie dough that you can eat.
That's true.
So you can buy the raw cookie, so you can bake your cookies, but then have a separate tub of the raw cookie dough that you can eat.
Yes.
Okay, I was going to ask a question really fast. From the campers, who remembers from the videos you watched last night what the pump Jon Snow looked into is called? Does anyone remember?
Oh, I think I know the answer to this. Maybe.
They watched a whole series of videos. They had an introduction from Beth and Peter yesterday on Jon Snow.
So you guys are Jon Snow experts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you can put it in the chat. Does anyone remember what it was called? Which the pump was called?
No Googling.
I might call on someone if no one answers. Yeah, what city was it in? Yes, it was Broad Street Pump. Good job.
There you go. And I'll just add, I didn't know that until I was in grad school. So props to you guys.
Yeah.
But we'll have a Jeopardy game on Friday where some of these questions might come back on Friday for Jeopardy.
Throw that one in there in your memory, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay. Let's see. This next one was a very interesting question. So this question was, what is a disease that can come back from the past that scientists don't know where it originated from? I think I have a relatively lackluster answer, and that I'm actually not sure. I think science has done a pretty good job that when new diseases or diseases come up, we're typically able to track down where we think that it came from, or kind of how that disease came to be. Obviously, it's not perfect. I think COVID is probably a pretty good example where, scientists were able to narrow down that it likely came from a bat, that type of lineage. I was reading something pretty interesting a couple of weeks ago about I think it's in Siberia, maybe there's some permafrost that is defrosting, and there's been some research looking at bacteria, viruses, other things that could be in there. So there's those types of situations that could happen. But yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, obviously there are some answers, if diseases that have vaccines, and if vaccine usage decreases over time. So looking at something like measles, that is very infectious. If we get below a certain percent of our population that's vaccinated against a disease like that, it could make a really bad resurgence. I mean, some of those are starting to come back a little bit more than they had been in the last couple of decades. So there's those types as well that we already know a lot about, and we know that there are ways to prevent them. But yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think the more that we learn about some, like this permafrost stuff, defrosting, those kinds of situations could breed some interesting diseases from the past that we don't know about. So that was a good question. I'm sorry, I feel like I don't have a better answer for that one. I might have to do some Googling later to see if there's a good answer online. Here's another good one. Let's see. Have you ever become sick when investigating? And then a second follow-up question was, what was the reaction of your loved ones when you decided to switch professions? So I'll start with kind of the second part of that question. I think my family was totally fine with it. I mean, I as you guys heard in my video, I was pre-vet almost my entire life until I was almost a senior in college. So I think my family was surprised when I told them, hey, I don't think this is what I want to do anymore, just because I had been so enthusiastic about that for a really long time. But I think, I was always the one in the family where they're like, yeah, cool, go do science stuff. I mean, I'm the only scientist in my family. And so a lot of what I did, they didn't understand in general. And they were like, just go do cool stuff, and I hope you're happy. So I was really lucky. I had a lot of family support with that. And for me, I was also lucky. I mean, I was in college. I wasn't really invested in a career or anything at that point. So it was a little bit easier for me to kind of switch up what I thought I wanted to do. But overall, they were very supportive. In terms of ever becoming sick when investigating, surprisingly, no. I think, so some of the investigations I've done with like environmental exposures, we wear personal protective equipment when we do those investigations if we need to. So I think I had, as part of my slides, I think I had a picture in there where I was sampling a swamp cooler on a roof, and you guys can't see it because my back is turned, but I did have a respirator on in that picture. I also had gloves on. So when I did like Legionnaire's disease investigation, so Legionella is a bacteria that people can be infected with when it's aerosolized in water. So when I would do those investigations, if I have to, turn on a shower or, go on a roof and look at a swamp cooler or a cooling tower, anything where that water could be aerosolized and we think it's possible there's something in there, we wear that type of equipment. I think one of the ones I'm surprised I didn't get sick from was when I was doing a lot of work on dairy farms. And I think we didn't wear respirators or anything like that on the dairy farm. I think I would have died of heat exhaustion if we were out there in the summer wearing that type of equipment. But we tried to be really good about like hand washing, hand hygiene. We washed our hands all the time, changing clothes before I would get into my car. Just because there's so much, when you're on a farm, I mean, there's cows everywhere. They poop where they want to poop. And so you're touching them and that kind of thing. I do know there were, I have worked with people that have gotten like crypto from working with cows, like baby cows, especially. There's just cryptosporidium everywhere. I was lucky that I did not get sick, but that has happened before. We also have investigations, like we did a hepatitis A outbreak investigation 2019 into 2020. And that was one where, prior to people going out and doing any field work, if our staff weren't already vaccinated against hepatitis A, we would offer that vaccine to people. Same thing with like a meningitis outbreak. We would offer that vaccine to our staff before they would do any type of field work as well. So yeah, we do take precautions, but sometimes it happens. And someone put a comment that crypto is a no-no. Yeah. Crypto is not fun. You will be sad for probably at least a week if you get crypto. It causes very bad diarrhea and stomach pains and some other things, in case any of you did not already know what that was.
So our cases this week all have severe diarrhea and stomach pains.
Oh, well, something to consider.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
okay, let's see. The next question on here. Have you ever come across a disease that hasn't been identified before? So I have never come across a disease that hasn't been identified before. However, I have identified a new species of a disease that already existed. So a couple of years ago, I did a Legionnaire's disease investigation out at a hotel, and I can't remember how much I talked about in my presentation, Legionnaire's disease, but just as a quick recap, it's a bacteria that ends up in fresh water. And then if people inhale like droplets or something from that water, it's possible that they could get Legionnaire's disease. It causes pneumonia. It has a pretty low attack rate. So most people who are exposed to it don't get sick, mainly people who are older or have some pre-existing conditions that may like lower their immune response. And we had this hotel, and because we knew it was Legionnaire's disease, we knew to look at any water sources, since that's where Legionella comes from. It can't exist without fresh water. So we were looking at the pool, we were looking at, the showers, ice machine. That picture of me on the roof was at that hotel, looking at the swamp cooler. So we took water samples from all over the place. And one of the samples that we ended up collecting from the pool in that particular hotel, when our lab, I was working for the state health department at the time, when our lab was doing the analyses on it, they could identify the fact that it was Legionella, but there are more than 60 species of Legionella. And so our lab wasn't able to identify the species. We had comparisons to most species, but not all of them. So we sent it to CDC to say, hey, we were able to narrow down, and eliminate some species, but we can't quite figure out what species this is. And so CDC did a bunch of testing on it, and then they came back and said, hey, we also don't know what type of species this is. This is a species we've never seen before. So that was a pretty interesting experience to go through and find a new species of a disease in a very weird place. This was in a hotel pool in rural Colorado. So that was interesting. Let's see. The next question, this is mainly related to the work I've done with E. coli. So how many types of E. coli are there, and how do you tell the difference between all of them? And then what is E. coli shedding? So E. coli in general, there are more than, I think 600 or 700 species of E. coli that exist out there. The good news is that the vast majority of those do not cause harm. So if you were to ingest that, or an animal to ingest that, little to nothing would happen. There are 6 main groups of what we call pathogenic E. coli. So those are types of E. coli that can cause illness in people. And so my specific research, I was looking at Shiga toxin producing E. coli, or you may see it called STEC. And so that was one of those 6 groups in there. And so how you tell the difference between them, I guess you could kind of think about it like people when you're looking at diseases. You have groups of them, but it's kind of like people. You have your hair color, your eye color, your skin color. You have these identifiable traits that make you you. And so when you do kind of enhanced genetic testing on these diseases, it's the same thing. We see very specific characteristics that are unique to something like E. coli or Salmonella or Legionella that we're able to distinguish from each other. In some instances, you have diseases where you have, lots of similar factors like E. coli, where on the kind of grand scheme, they're all very similar, but then have these unique differences that kind of set them apart, like with that, Shiga toxin producing E. coli, where there's something about that specific type that makes it bad for people. And so that's typically how we tell the differences. We do genetic testing similar to like people, to look down kind of at the lowest level to see what differences there are. And sometimes you see things like with COVID, I'm sure you all have heard about like variants, and that's mainly just you have, this, say for example, you were using COVID, we had what we called like the wild type COVID, the original COVID, I guess, that happened. And as it passes through the population, small things start to change, but in general, it's still COVID. And so that can also happen too with diseases, where there can be small mutations that slightly change them. It could change how infectious they are. It could change the severity of the disease, but overall it's still that same disease. And then E. coli shedding, I probably should have explained that better in my video. So E. coli, as with most things, there's kind of a cycle of life with E. coli. And so we know that cows are sort of a reservoir for E. coli, where once it gets into their system, there's a process in there where it's replicating. And then when cows poop, they're shedding it. So it's exiting their body in their stool. And so what we were interested in was looking in was kind of like, what is the life cycle of E. coli within a cow? And if we're looking at things like these specific toxigenic genes that we were looking at, trying to figure out which one of these may be more bad, I guess, which strains are different from each other. We wanted to know if there were differences there as well. So if I'm testing a cow on one day and I find that, yes, they're positive for S-Tech, and then I test that same cow the next day, does that mean that that cow doesn't have S-Tech anymore? Or was that, like an error in sampling that we just didn't find it? So there's a lot of questions in there, but that's kind of what that project was.
Tori, I don't know if you saw the chat, but there's a question from one of our campers about, could a harmless species of E. coli mutate to become dangerous?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I think it's possible. I mean, I think that's probably possible with a lot of diseases where you could have one that was considered harmless before and then becomes dangerous. I think there's some examples of also the ability for diseases to mutate to become infectious to people. So like there are some like certain types of flu or like coronaviruses that we know exist, but only exist like in a specific animal species. Like say there are some types of like bird flu or something where, only birds can be infected, and then something changes within there as it, moves through that population, it mutates, and then now it has the ability to infect people. So there's also examples of that too, of diseases changing over time where, previously they wouldn't have been able to infect a person and now they are. So yeah, definitely you can have mutations that cause it to become more dangerous. So that's happened with some of the COVID variants that we've seen, where some of these variants have made that virus more infectious. So more people who are exposed are more likely to get it, and then have also made so that the disease severity may be more. So, compared to the original type, if someone gets this new type of COVID, they may have a higher hospitalization rate, something along those lines. Yeah, that's a good question. I have a question that came to me in the chat in here that says, how do you maintain good mental health in your field of work? I think that's a really important question, very timely question. I think everybody has different coping mechanisms with it. I think definitely the last year and a half has been very stressful for a lot of people in their professions, and dealing with this type of work. Even before COVID, with dealing with outbreaks, it can be mentally draining. I mean, you're talking to people who, there are diseases involved in what we do. And most people, when they get a diagnosis of any disease or a loved one gets a diagnosis, it's typically not good news. So that's a piece of it that can be difficult. Like if you're interviewing somebody, asking them questions, like sometimes people can get emotional, if there are deaths involved, hospitalizations, so all of that can be really draining. I think on my specific team, we lean a lot on our coworkers. I mean, we're all doing very similar work. We all understand the struggles. We understand kind of these considerations. And so you have kind of an audience of people that you're with all the time that have firsthand knowledge of what you're going through. We also have done things like group, and it's not necessarily therapy, but it's more just like group sessions where you can like talk in a group with people that we work with, like, hey, this is something that's a struggle for me, or, someone else may say the same thing and you can come up with solutions. I think for me too, I rely a lot on my family. I very much try to, if I'm not on call, I very much try to put my work away from me, and not stare at my phone and emails and stuff if I don't have to, because you do need time to kind of get away from that. That can be hard when you're talking about like being on call on weekends and things like that, but most of us are not on call all the time. And then I have a lot of my own hobbies, and so that's why I try to, if I'm not working or doing something like that, I try to do something that I enjoy, like my hobbies, like cooking or playing video games or something along those lines. So yeah, I think that's a really good question. You'll probably get a lot of different answers depending on who you ask that to. But probably the number one thing is just making sure that you're aware of kind of what you're feeling, and seeking help if you need it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Let's see, another question that came into the chat. How would you describe the importance of the work folks in your field do in the face of a changing climate in regards to, say, the dynamics of disease prevalence or the emergence of novel disease? That's a good question. So I mean, public health work is very important. I think prior to COVID, a lot of what public health did was most people didn't really know unless you were involved, you know, say you were involved in an outbreak or had been diagnosed with some sort of disease. And so, I mean, the main work of what my team is with public health, there's a wide variety of things that people are doing. So that could be community health, that could be, you know, women and children, it could be tobacco. So in my specific world, I deal with communicable diseases. So that's kind of what I'll talk about. That's that kind of sector of public health specifically. I mean, it is satisfying that when we're doing these investigations, a lot of the time, most of the time, the goal is to stop the spread of this disease or to stop an outbreak. And so when we're able to kind of figure out what's causing something or figure out what's going on, that is a really satisfying feeling. And it feels important to know, like, hey, I helped figure out about this outbreak and then it stopped, which meant fewer people got sick. You know, we didn't have any additional illness. So I think like one cool outbreak that we worked on probably about a year, or no, I guess this was about 2 years ago, was norovirus in oysters. And what actually happened was, you know, we were getting reports of norovirus in people, but typically people get norovirus from exposure to other people. It's a very, very infectious disease. And so, but we started looking into it and realizing that, you know, people are reporting going out to eat. And then, you know, within a day of that, and they were getting sick. And we worked with other counties who saw similar things in Colorado. And then we started hearing similar things in other states. Ended up finding out that it was, you know, the people, 100% of the people that reported eating raw oysters were getting noro, and 0% of the people that didn't eat oysters weren't getting it. And so what that happened was we sent that information. This was a specific oyster farm in Virginia, I want to say, you know, and we were able to work with CDC to close that farm temporarily until they could, you know, ensure that the water was clean. And so that's also cool, like seeing an actual policy change that happened based on the work that you did. And I think COVID, we saw a few examples of that, not as many as we would like to see, you know, where we were looking at the data and, you know, looking at certain populations that were being affected more than others, you know, especially like here in Colorado specifically, we started to see early in the pandemic, so March, April of last year, we started to see a higher percentage of cases among Hispanic or Latino residents in Denver, Colorado, but also in Denver, you know, and then we make recommendations to policyholders about outreach, you know, testing. You know, we didn't have a vaccine at that time, this was last year, you know, but a lot of outreach and how can we work with community-based organizations. And, you know, that type of work is also nice, like working with the community to kind of implement change. So I think that's probably the more important part, especially at the local level. You know, I have worked at the state health department and now I'm at the local level. And I think probably one of the most important pieces is like working with the community to implement change or to make things better. And that's kind of the overall goal, which is nice. Okay, let's see. Here's a question that I got this morning. So is there a certain disease or outbreak that you find particularly interesting? I'm probably super biased based on the work that I have personally done. I think Legionnaire's disease is very interesting to me, especially because that's one that's so heavily tied to the environment. And we know that things like climate change directly impact the prevalence of that disease and what we may see in the future. So it's a bacteria which tends to like warmer temperatures. So things like warming water temperatures have an impact on stuff like that. Same with Vibrio, is a bacteria that's in salt water that you can find in like things like oysters. And we know that like as oceans heat up, we'll see more of that type of bacteria. So that type of stuff is interesting. Also just investigations with environmental components are interesting to do. To me, like cholera, I think is a really interesting one, looking at like cholera epidemics that have happened in the past. And kind of how those can be prevented. So yeah, those are probably the ones I find interesting, is they tend to be ones I have, you know, personal experience working on. Let's see, another one. So what did you find important in your college years? So courses, professors, experience that led to your career path? I think probably for me, it was just having an open mind. I mean, I was pre-vet and I was taking, my degrees were biology and zoology. So I was obviously mainly taking classes to meet my degree, but I also took, you know, other classes as I was able to, electives and things like that I just thought were interesting. Like I took a creative writing class. Like I'm not a writer, but that's cool. I thought it was cool. And it helps me now with like grant writing and things like that. in terms of leading to my career path, I talked a little bit about this in my video last night, but it was actually kind of happenstance, I guess, that I came across epidemiology. I actually learned about it from a genetics professor when I was in college, which genetics was a class I was required to take for my degree, but I ended up finding it to be a really interesting class. And that kind of first got me involved. And then I had done a couple of internships with professors. Like I had worked with one of my zoology professors. He had a lab doing research on mammals and a variety of things. And so I did connect to a few of my professors that way, you know, if they were doing work that I thought was super interesting. You know, I did typically try to go out of my way to, you know, talk to them more, pick their brain. If they had internship openings, I would go for them, that type of stuff. So definitely, you know, connections matter. I hate the expression, it's who you know, because that's not always the case. But when you do have connections with different people, it gives you the opportunity to learn about more things, potentially have a source in the future for jobs, like that type of stuff. So I think that was kind of important too, was getting to know your professors and making sure they knew who I was. And then let's see, the last question on this sheet that I got this morning, and then I can see that I got a few in the chat, which I'll move to next. So at what stage is a disease considered to be reported? So I think this probably ties back into what I had talked about at the beginning of this with reportable diseases. So at what stage it's to be reported? It's when somebody has a diagnosis. So for most of these diseases, that would be a lab test that comes back positive for that disease. And for example, so in Colorado, and this varies slightly by state, in Colorado, we have our reportable disease list. And all of the diseases on there are given a time frame for when they're required to be reported. And this varies based on kind of the severity, I guess, if you want to look at it, of that disease. So something like botulism, that's something that's like immediately reportable. So if you have somebody that's in the hospital that there's a suspicion they have botulism or they test positive for botulism, that's required to be reported to the health department immediately, like immediate phone call. There are other things. So like, let's say like Shigella, that's an enteric pathogen. Shigella is what we call a 4-day reportable. So when a doctor or somebody tests somebody for Shigella, if that person tests positive, that provider or lab or whoever has 4 days to report that to the health department. And so there are some that are 30-day reportable. So those are things like Candida, which can be like on skin. There's a longer time frame for those just because they're typically not as severe. And there isn't a public health response required immediately. So that's typically when it has to be reported, is when there's a diagnosis, or with some of them, it's a suspected diagnosis. So like botulism is one where if a doctor suspects that a person has botulism, they usually have to report that because to get tested, that testing is only done in a few places, like at the CDC. So there are some examples or some kind of exceptions within that as well. Okay, let's see, moving over into the chat. So here's a question that says, can you talk about what antibiotic resistance is and what that means for public health officials? So that's a good question. I'm sure you guys have probably heard about this in the news. So antibiotic resistance happens typically when you have inappropriate use of antibiotics, although that's not always the case. But essentially, if you have organisms that are being exposed to antibiotics, over time, they're gonna eventually become resistant to that specific antibiotic. So let's look like penicillin is like a very known antibiotic that's used. There are now some types of bacteria that if somebody is infected with that bacteria, if you treat them with penicillin, the penicillin's not going to work. And so when you hear, and there's a much more technical explanation for kind of how that happens. I'm not a microbiologist, so I don't know. I couldn't explain to you, I think, well enough about the actual process for antibiotic resistance. But kind of the reason why this matters so much is that developing new antibiotics isn't an easy process. And so when you have organisms that are becoming resistant to the treatment that has typically worked, we start running out of treatments that are available. And then you now have diseases that are untreatable that used to be treatable. And so that is a problem now with like looking at things like MRSA, if you've heard about that. What is that? Staph resistant. Yeah, I can't remember the rest of it, but
methicillin resistant Staph aureus.
There we go. So like MRSA is one of the big ones that's coming out, but that's the reason why it's such a big deal, is now you're going to end up with infections that could have been treated in the past, but no longer can, because of our ability to create new treatments and kind of the adaptation that these organisms are making. And one of the things that it happens with, if you have antibiotic over prescription, so like if somebody goes to the doctor and says, I have a cold, typically you wouldn't want to just give that person an antibiotic. Like, you don't know if it's actually a bacteria. So if you have people with like a viral infection being treated with antibiotics, that's just kind of more fuel to the fire, I guess, giving organisms, more exposure to adapt to these treatments that aren't necessary. So that's been kind of one of the big factors of antibiotic resistance, is kind of over prescribing them when they're not necessary. And for public health officials, I mean, for us, what that means is it's, we have the potential for more disease spread. If you have more people that are not able to be treated for something like a bacterial infection that's infectious to other people. So you could have more disease spread, more outbreaks. You could have, hospital acquired infections could potentially increase as well, because you have vulnerable patients in those populations. Again, a microbiologist might be able to better explain that than me. Okay, let's see. Another question that we have in the chat: how do public opinions on the politics of vaccinations and the like affect your work? Does it slow you down, cause you to reconsider different approaches to educate the public? So yeah, I mean, public opinion, politics, all of that kind of stuff, especially with COVID, that's probably pretty visible, the effect that that's had on our work. So I think, and I mentioned this a little bit, previously, we have diseases that we investigate that have vaccines or have, those preventions available. And when you're dealing with a population that may not have as much protection as they could, obviously there's a certain number of people that can't get something like a certain types of vaccines if they're allergic, or if there's another medical reason. But in general, we rely on what we call, herd immunity. You've probably heard that term a lot recently as well. So looking at something like measles, we know that measles can be prevented with a vaccine, but the vaccine is not 100% effective. Most vaccines are not 100% effective, but measles is super, super infectious. If you expose somebody to measles, the chances of them getting it if they haven't been vaccinated are pretty high. It's just a very infectious disease, and we'll start to see larger outbreaks of those types of diseases. If public opinion on vaccinations goes down and people don't get vaccinated. So that's one thing too. Same with, with COVID, we know, again, the COVID vaccines that are available are not 100% effective, but they are very effective. And so not being able to have a whole lot of buy-in up front on vaccines, I wouldn't say it's, made me reconsider what I do. It's just something that exists there, but we just have to kind of amend our ways. I mean, you've heard some of the ways, I'm sure, that some states or local health departments are kind of trying to increase vaccines. So like the lottery that's happening, like we're doing one here in Colorado. There's other places that are giving away things. So like, I mean, incentives are now a big thing. So that happens. So that's one strategy that can be used. In terms of education, we usually try to be pretty creative in our education, and we've had to, this depends on kind of every example. So like with that Water World outbreak that I told you guys about, we ended up doing education and targeted outreach. We went through like Nextdoor, Twitter, Instagram, putting up like physical posters, like coming up with cute graphics to get the message across. So that's also something that we learn a lot too from people. Like if we try one method of outreach or something and then it's not working, we may go to say like community-based organizations, or we may do like polls with people, or like a focus group to kind of get the community input. And I think especially where I'm at now working for a local health department, I mean, we're serving the community. And so sometimes you need community buy-in, and that may just straight up be asking people, what information would you like to make an informed decision, something along those lines. And then going from there. But yeah, it definitely causes us to slow down and reconsider approaches if what we're doing up front isn't working. And sometimes it'll never work. I mean, there's some challenges that you may not be able to tackle easily or in a short amount of time, but we'll still do whatever we can. Let's see, here's a question. How many diseases or outbreaks arise or happen that don't get announced? Like, are they too small to be? So most of the outbreaks that I have worked on are not media worthy. I guess I would put it that way. So it depends on where you work, in public health, especially kind of what the approach is with the media. But if we don't have to go to the media, we tend not to, partially because sometimes outbreaks happen and it's no fault of that business. So for example, like the one I talked about with like onions, you know, say you have a Mexican restaurant and they happen to be like onions are in a lot of their dishes and they're using those. If there was a contamination of that ingredient, say at the farm level or something along, or, you know, before it got to them and they were part of an outbreak because of that, I mean, that wasn't really their fault. And that happens pretty frequently. And so typically the only ones that get picked up are if we have to do mass notification. So like Waterworld, because we didn't have a way to contact people otherwise. Sometimes they get picked up if we do have an event where we do like a small notification. So say there was like a restaurant and we, you know, contact people from that restaurant to talk to them, ask them questions, or like a hotel and we send out a notice to hotel guests and stuff. And then that can end up in the media. But yeah, by far, most of the outbreaks I work on are not public record in that way, not necessarily because they're too small, but you know, sometimes they're just not interesting enough, I think, to be picked up, or sometimes it's just not helpful for us to go to the media with this type of stuff. Something like, say you had, I don't know, like a high school reunion and there was a picnic and people got food poisoning from the potato salad. I mean, we know who was there, we know who to contact, that kind of thing. We don't need to go outside of that. And then for outbreaks, typically an outbreak we define as 2 or more unrelated people. So we have some outbreaks that are only 2 people, some that are 3 people. So some of them can be very small as well.
Tori, I want to be respectful of your time,
Yeah.
because I know you're a very busy person, but I think that was some fantastic information from you today, and we sincerely appreciate it. If the campers have any follow-up questions and send us any questions, would it be all right if we send any follow-up contact information to you?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you all want to give a round of thank you and applause to Tori for her time today, for all of her valuable information. But I think that was absolutely tremendous. And Tori, as you were talking about the possibilities for transmission and the likelihood for transmission, our next activity is actually a probability activity.
Cool.
So we get them in the habit of thinking about probability. So with that, I want to let everybody know that we are actually I'm going to share my screen.
Thanks, everybody.
We're going to take a break, but we're going to randomly assign you to rooms when we come back. So take a break, but you're going to be randomly shuffled around so that way you get to meet some new people. Maybe you already know them, maybe you don't, maybe you see your mentors, maybe you don't. But the mentors are still going to be teamed up in their pairs going to specific rooms. So mentors, please write down the room you're headed to. And we will once again thank Tori for her time and her valuable expertise and her passion. Thank you for sharing your passion with us. And we're going to learn more about what you do. So, all right.